So once you have enough flights in the beginner flight mode that you're very comfortable with takeoffs, flying around, and landings, you can move into the intermediate mode. Now, normally I would suggest that you still take off and land in the beginner mode, and maybe you switch to the intermediate mode in the air, and then switch back to the beginner mode to land. I am going to go ahead and make this entire flight from takeoff to flying and landing in the intermediate mode to explain to you and show you some of the differences, and also why you may still want to take off and land in the beginner flight mode. So really quick refresher, we've got the B switch here on the top left-hand corner. This is our flight mode switch. The 0 position all the way back is beginner. The middle position is intermediate mode. The big difference between the two is that in the intermediate mode, it never self-levels. So when you let go of the stick, it stays pretty much where it's at. You have to fly it back to level. If you hold the stick all the way over to one side, it will still have a bank angle limit. It will still stop. If you pull back, it will still stop and won't get upside down. But that angle is higher than in the beginner mode. So you can turn more tightly, you can maneuver more aggressively, but you ultimately are learning now to get the airplane back to level on your own, which is what you need to know before you can get into the experienced flight mode. So I'm going to go ahead and take off in the intermediate mode. So I'm going to taxi back out to the center line of the runway. Wind is pretty much from right to left down the runway. So we're going to take off into that. So again, I'm using that left-hand stick, the throttle and rudder and nose wheel steering to steer the airplane into position on the center line of the runway. Now, in the beginner flight mode, when you get to full throttle, it will add up elevator to climb. In the intermediate mode, it does not do that. So you will need to pull back on the stick when you're about 2/3 to full throttle to actually get the airplane to take off the ground. So here I'm going to advance the throttle. I'm going to use that left-hand stick to steer and keep it straight. Now that I'm at full power, I'll pull back on the stick and climb. And now it's climbing. I'm going to throttle back, lose a little bit of altitude here. All right, so in the intermediate mode, again, the airplane will not self-level. So if I let go of the stick, you see it just keeps turning basically the way it was. Now, over time, because the wing has dihedral, it has a V shape to it when you looked at it from the front, it will level over time aerodynamically, but it doesn't self-level like it did in the beginner flight mode. Immediately bounce back to level. So it's a bit harder to fly in this mode. You definitely need to have plenty of experience in the beginner mode, but this is teaching you to keep the airplane level when you're not turning. So if I make a left-hand turn and pull back on the stick, just like I did in the beginner mode, when I want to stop turning, I need to go back to the right a little bit. And in this case, I can see it's climbing a bit. So I'm going to add some down trim. So I'm pushing forward on this trimmer lever. I don't want it to climb too much when I'm at about half power. So I'm going to get a little bit more down trim here. Trimming is one of the hardest things you'll have to learn. Most airplanes don't require a lot of trimming, but some airplanes like this one do require a little bit of trimming between the different flight modes. But normally once you adjust into one, you get used to flying through it in the others. So I'm just going to fly the racetrack pattern like I did in the beginner flight mode, now in the intermediate flight mode. So I'm going to make a left-hand turn down here. Pull back on the stick to maintain altitude, make that turn a little tighter. When I'm flying in line with the runway, I'm going to level back off with some right and keep the airplane flying straight down the runway until I'm ready to make my next left-hand turn. All right, so I'm going to make my next left-hand 180-degree turn, pull back on the stick a little bit, and when it's flying opposite direction to what we took off, I'm going to level back off. Now, a real quick note, like we talked about, just like the beginner mode, it does have angle limits. So if I hold the stick all the way over to the left, it stops. But see, it goes almost 90 degrees before it stops, which is a lot more than it did in the beginner mode. So I can turn a lot tighter, a lot more aggressively if I want to, but I also can get into trouble faster. So I also want to show you what the difference is in high rates and low rates. Now, in the beginner mode, you should always fly in high rates. That's what this switch is here, the F switch. When it's in the 0 position, the up position, that's the highest amount of turn. See how it banks almost 90 degrees? And then I can pitch back pretty aggressively. When I flip that switch to low rates, now it doesn't turn as much and as fast. So now I can't turn quite as tight as I could with high rates. That's why in the beginner mode, you never want to really use low rates, because it will turn so slowly that you may actually lose the airplane. You can't get it back fast enough. Even in the intermediate mode, I don't really like using the low rates. I pretty much always stick to the high rates in both the intermediate and the experienced, or intermediate and beginner flight modes. In the experienced flight mode, where you have no limits, sometimes it's then beneficial to use the low rates. So you can see I'm turning around here. I'll show you the bank angle at limit again. So you can see it's higher than in the beginner mode. And when I let go of the stick, it doesn't really self-level on its own. I've got to fly the airplane back to level. So again, it's quite a bit more work than the beginner mode. Real quick note, if you ever get in trouble, let's say you turn too much, you don't really know what the airplane's doing, you have two choices. One, flip to beginner mode. It'll immediately go back to level. You can turn, it won't turn as tight as it did before. You have a little bit of time to regain your composure. I'm gonna go back to the intermediate mode. I'm gonna get into trouble again. And this time I'm gonna use the panic recovery button to help get me out of that. So I'm gonna turn really tight. I'm losing control, tap the panic recovery button. It immediately goes back to level. Now it's done with panic recovery mode. It's still in the intermediate mode though. So it's easy to get in trouble again if you're not careful, but then you can just hit panic recovery again. But I still recommend if you get into a lot of trouble in the intermediate mode, I would recommend just going right back to the beginner mode. That self-levels it. That makes it a little bit easier to manage your turns and to not get into trouble again. All right, back to intermediate mode. I'm gonna pull back on the stick so you can see that it's got a pitch angle limit much higher than it did in the beginner mode. You can also push down more aggressively. You really should never do that because you can see you're going straight into the ground very quickly if you do that. Throttle back a little bit. So now that we're getting a little bit low on our battery power, I do want to start setting up for my landing. I want to practice some landing approaches in the intermediate mode, just like we did in the beginner mode. So I'm going to line up with the runway, throttle back, let it come down a little bit. But you can see that I'm now having to do more work to keep the wings level. Now, there are gyros that are still working to help keep the airplane from bouncing around too much. But ultimately, if I let go of the stick, it just keeps doing what it was doing. I got to either continue my turn or fly it back to level. So in this case, I'm going to fly it back to level, going the opposite direction that I took off outside the runway. Now I'm going to make a left-hand turn to get back over the runway. And when I line up with the runway, I'm going to pull my power back, give it a little bit of right aileron to get it level, and I'm going to let it come down. Let it come down. It's going to come down more aggressively than it came down in the beginner mode. And then when it gets close to the ground, I'm going to start to flare. Keep that nose up till I touch those mains. And again, when you're on the ground, you want to use that left-hand stick to steer. So let's try another takeoff really quick in the intermediate mode. So I'm advancing the throttle slowly. I'm steering. I'm pulling back on the stick to climb. A decent rate of climb. You don't want to climb too much because you can stall the airplane. So you can see I can pull all the way back and it'll, at some point, it'll pitch back over because it loses the amount of thrust that it needs to maintain airspeed. Now in this case, I can fly it back into what I call the pattern. So in this case, we're doing the downwind leg of our landing pattern. So I'm at about 1/3 power. And again, it takes time to learn just what altitude and throttle setting, how far out you need to be before you set up for your turn onto final approach. In this case, I'm a little higher than normal, but there's a little bit of wind. So I'm going to keep the power up a little more than I usually do at this point. Now that I'm lined up with the runway, I'm going to pull the power and let it descend naturally. I'm still going to have to work on keeping the wings level with that right-hand stick, but I'll let it come down. And again, the goal is really to touch down in front of ourselves, not to the left too far, not to the right too far. I'm going to go a little farther to my right, but not too bad. And as it gets closer, I'm going to start to flare, 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 touch down nice and easy. All right, I'm going to make it a touch and go. So I'm going to immediately, not even let it slow down, I'm going to go right back into a takeoff. I'm going to make a really fast turnaround and go into a landing. Now, when you're less experienced, you're not going to want to make a fast turnaround, but I will tell you, the secret to becoming a really good pilot is to practice your landings and your takeoffs many times per flight. Until you're very, very comfortable, very, very competent, you really should be making multiple takeoffs and landings whenever you feel comfortable. Don't just make one takeoff and one landing, because a lot of times you'll do that out of necessity and you may not get good at it. You have to practice it to get good at it. So here I've got it coming down, letting it come down, lined up on the center of the runway. I'm going to start to flare, touch down, immediately advance the throttle to do a touch and go, pull back on the right stick to climb, turn a little to the left, pull back some more. I'm going to go on to my downwind leg, throttle back to about half or so. Again, that throttle setting varies on your downwind leg, and even on your final approach, how long you keep your throttle in. Go down a little further to the left. This time we're going to do a full stop landing. So I'm make a left-hand turn, reduce my throttle to about 1/3. And now when I line up on the center line of the runway, I'll level off and I'm going to throttle off all together. Let it come down. Let it come down. And as it gets closer to the runway, I'm going to keep the wings level. And I'm going to start to pull back on the elevator stick to flare, make a nice easy touchdown. There you go. And again, now that it's on the ground, I'm going to use that left-hand stick to steer and taxi. So I'm going to taxi off the runway inside of our yellow line here. And now I'm going to taxi back to our no taxi line area. But there you have it. So the intermediate mode is noticeably more difficult than the beginner mode, much like I mentioned in previous videos that it's like training wheels on a bike. When you have the training wheels all the way down and the bike can't tip left or right at all, that's the beginner mode. When you're in the intermediate mode, you've raised those wheels and now you can tip a little bit, but not all the way. But you also then have to maintain your balance on the bike. You have to keep the airplane level when you're not making a turn. It's a bit more work. If you ever get into trouble, go right back to the beginner mode. But once you get comfortable in the intermediate mode, then you're ready for the experience mode. Be sure to watch that video next.